Thanks so much to the four of you. It's very powerful to be sitting here in New York and to know that there's all this brain power and expertise at Oxford simultaneously with all of us. This is working well. We didn't know if it would work, but it seems to be working nicely, and I think it tees up our conversation about fraud detection by journalists very nicely as well, because obviously journalists were instrumental in explaining this to us. And so we have our journalism panel now. So Bethany, we'll turn it over to you.
Okay, well, David, we were going to start with you, actually, so.
Okay. So a little bit of good news. This is maybe coming off of the first panel this morning. I now teach investigative reporting at Berkeley, and I'm really pleased to report that so many of my students want to be the next Bethany McLean, and so many of my students want to be the next John Carreyrou. The students recognize that corporate fraud is a target-rich environment for journalists. And so we're going to talk a little bit with Emily and Bethany about how we go about doing this. And I guess I was going to start with Emily, and maybe to come at it from the reverse side, because when I think about 2008, and then I think about all of the journalism, the great journalism that was done about all of the fraud, but unfortunately, so much of that journalism happened after we had all lost our butts in the stock market. And then I think about like crypto, right? And it's sort of a similar kind of pattern. And I guess the one tough question I think we should all be asking ourselves as journalists is, why aren't we doing a better job at getting to these stories before the carnages happen?
Well, I was really impressed by the mechanism by which Jack Willoughby deflated the tech bubble in 2000 with a story that was basically just asking questions. So I tried to do that for crypto, and I published a story in January about, how is it that these different companies are offering like 9% guaranteed returns for giving your tokens over to them. And the just asking questions thing didn't really work. But until there was an example of just the air going out of one of these companies, there was really nothing you could do besides ask questions. It was not an effective tool to prevent really vulnerable retail investors from putting sometimes their entire life savings in these companies. And so I think one of the most sort of difficult things about writing about fraud is like calling it fraud, which actually you did at the New York Times in a way that few other journalists have ever done. And what was so special about that?
Well, let's see. There's two times that's really come up. One was a story I wrote with two other reporters saying that Donald Trump and his family had committed tax fraud, and in the world's longest New York Times story, I think. And the other was writing about Walmart, and writing about how Walmart had kind of bribed its way across Mexico. And those were two heavy lifts to get to the point where on the front page of the New York Times you can accuse the President of the United States or one of the largest corporations in the world of out and out fraud. It took 18 months with Donald Trump. It took a year plus with Walmart. And because it is really painstaking, difficult, digging kind of work that ultimately rests on documents, and it rests on getting to sources. And I remember when we were, just before we were about to publish the story accusing President Trump of committing tax fraud with his family, going through it with a New York Times lawyer, and going word by word through a 14,000 word story to say, how do you know what you're fixing to say? And been through this yourself, and I'm sure Bethany has too.
What's the moment when you know that you have enough to publish? I'd love for both of you to talk about that. What's the moment where you feel like this is solid enough and I have the thing?
We got to ask you that question,
Yeah.
right? 'Cause
No,
that,
let's start with you.
No, seriously,
we're-
when did you, you know, I mean, because you were really out there on your own, right?
I think so. I think they're almost two different types of stories at the risk of characterizing them too loosely. But one is the sort of story where you are asking questions and where it is actually enough to ask questions. And it is enough to sort of start the public discussion saying something doesn't make sense here. And you asking the question can start that. And that's one set of standards to get to that point. And the other is actually to use the word fraud and say there's something that, and I think those are two very different things. And so you are more experienced in this is actually fraud and we're going to call it what it is, whereas I think I've made more of a career of saying something doesn't smell right here. And I think the standards are different.
The standards are different, right? I mean, certainly with investigative reporting and the idea that you're gonna actually say this is what we have found. You're not resting on an inspector general's report. You're not resting on some grand jury report. You're saying this is what we found, and I think you know that's why these things take 18 months, or why it takes a year. But what I'm always looking for is I'm looking for basically what I think probably most prosecutors are looking for, which is just layers and layers and layers of intersecting, confirming, overlapping evidence that are all sort of you know, bringing you back to the same honest conclusion. That this is fraud.
What's the moment for you when you are sure you have enough to publish? Or is there ever a moment? Are you always racked by self-doubt that you might be missing something?
There's a lot of self-doubt, but I also think that it's a great step in the process when you have enough that you just feel like you need to go ask the sort of company in question or the people in question, like, look at what I have. What's your response to all this? And when those responses don't add up, or when the response is just so clearly like an ass covering exercise, then you're just like, oh, this is so great. You know, like they don't have a good answer for this. And then you know that you're really moving in the right direction.
What about for you?
Well, so I think when I was younger, I viewed that more, it felt more frightening because I guess I still always have that aspect of me where I always worry that I'm wrong and that there is something in the response. I want to be more the sort of person who will hear that response and think they're hiding something, but I always see it through the lens of what could I be missing, and so it always knocks me for a loop. And I think there is that moment, which I guess is a little different in journalism than in investing, where you have to hit publish, right? And you have to let it go out the door and every fact has to be right. And I suppose that's akin to making a decision to short a stock or buy a stock, but it's different because you can change your mind after you've shorted the stock or bought the stock. You can let the new evidence come in and say, I've changed my position. Whereas as a journalist, once you've published, you've said it. And you've said it legally and you've said it for your reputation. And I think those are two slightly different things, but that fear of being wrong or that fear of having missed something is always, it still gets to me because I've had so many stories where you're looking at something through one perspective and all of a sudden it shifts and you see it through a different perspective and you think, how did I almost miss this? How did I almost miss this really big thing? Have you had that experience too?
Always. I can't think of a single story where it didn't take twists and turns. And the story never ends where you think it's going to end. And I think that feeling of that fear of being wrong, right? The paranoia, the thing that wakes you up at 3 o'clock in the morning, night after night after night, wondering, wait, can I say that? Do I know that? Is an important survival skill.
Well, I want to go back to something that you'd said earlier. Do you think we do a good job as journalists? How do you think, when you look over the past couple of decades, how would you rank us?
I don't feel like qualified to answer that, and I do think though that just personally I'm not satisfied. I think that there are just too many times in recent history when we have sort of watched something happen, and then afterwards hindsight shows us that it was really obvious that there were all these issues and no one called them out. And I think that the one good thing about the process of journalism is that it includes almost like a high reliability process where there should be someone questioning everything, and it's your editor. And hopefully you hate your editor in that good way, where it's like, oh my God, why are you so annoying about this? Why do you keep asking me to, justify X, Y, and Z? And that's the kind of process that produces rigor. And we just hope that we have enough of that, and we also hope that we can, that is our process for society. And I don't really think we've done all we can. I think we can do more. I hope we can.
What do you think, David?
I think there's a kind of paradoxical answer to this. In some ways, I think that the great journalism that's been done exposing corporate fraud, it's some of the best journalism I've ever seen, and yet it also feels at the same time like its impact is not being felt. It's not working, and I think maybe part of it is that the too often journalists are exposing really significant misdeeds in the C-suites of major corporations, and really not very much happens. There's not much. I mean, usually what it ends up doing is it disappears into the long negotiations with DOJ and the SEC, followed by some giant agreement to pay a bunch of money, but nobody admits wrongdoing, nobody goes to jail. And there's something about that. I think that for journalism to really work, it means that the rest of the system also has to respond and work. And when that doesn't happen, I think the value of what we're doing is diminished.
So pause a little bit more on that, because you've had two cases, one where nothing did happen. You did this immense amount of work on Walmart, and you exposed in a very convincing way a lot of wrongdoing, and yet there were no prosecutions after that. And Trump is TBD, I guess, right, in some ways.
Yeah, I mean, so this was a classic example of that, right? Walmart, we all know this, that after these kinds of cases, effectively the DOJ outsources the criminal investigation to the company itself, which then hires great lawyers, and those great lawyers spend months and months and months bamboozling the DOJ and the SEC, and then ultimately it ends up in a conference room in Washington where they're basically just talking about what's the number. And that's what happened in this case. Walmart paid, $1 billion+ in various FCPA penalties, but nobody was criminally prosecuted. Yes, a bunch of people lost their jobs, but there was really, at the end of the day, $1 billion meant nothing to Walmart.
Especially when it was $1 billion of shareholders' money, right?
Right, exactly. Do you know what I mean? I mean, do you ever? I mean, at least when you think about, like in your case with the Enron case, people did go to jail, right? I mean, that's actually startling now. I mean, to think about people actually going to jail.
Right. I was thinking about this in light of the comments on the first panel when Jim and Soren were talking, and I thought that it is, I've become very skeptical about what prosecutions actually do for deterrence. I remember my co-author Peter Alkind and I, on the Enron book, wrote a piece in the wake of the convictions of Jeff Skilling and Ken Lay, and we all have our pieces as journalists that we look back and are like, did I actually write that? And so we wrote, everything has changed now, the world is different. Corporate executives are now on notice that
yes.
behavior in the gray area won't be tolerated. And this was summer 2006, yeah, when the events that would cause the financial crisis were already well underway. So it was like, oops, that didn't work so well. And then of course nobody in the financial crisis was prosecuted. And when you actually look at Enron and then you look at the financial crisis, it's not like one was clear-cut black and white fraud. And what happened in the financial crisis was great, this is the kind of behavior we want to see taking place throughout corporate America. They were both in the gray area, and yet one was prosecuted and one wasn't. So not only was there no real deterrence effect from the Enron prosecutions that I can see, but the attitude of the Justice Department, and Jesse has written about this really well, obviously, but the attitude of the Justice Department was completely different just a few years later. And so behavior that was in the gray area didn't get prosecuted. So you've seen that sort of thing as well, right?
Yes, and that leads me to wonder, and I'm asking both of you, should we be doing more sort of like conceptual fraud investigations about the system? Like, do we
Well, I
need
like
to
the sound of that, conceptual fraud.
like, do we need to point out general bullshit in the system? Is that what we're doing wrong?
What do you mean? Like, give me an example.
Well,
of
like
that.
you just took us through the Walmart non-event.
Right.
Like, what do we have a role in explaining to people better? I mean, in the way Jesse has, but for a wider swath of corporate America, how this works and why the big guys in the suits always win.
Well, we heard a little bit of that this morning in the panel with Jim. We're talking about Jim and Soren talking about their students who had such low expectations that anyone would be held accountable. And it's dripping into the culture in a larger way. I mean, the acceptance of BS, in not just in the corporate world, but obviously in the political world as well. And I think this I was reading the project that just came out yesterday on Uber. And this was a kind of another classic case. So there was a huge leak of 125,000 or so emails and text messages from the C-suite of Uber. And you have 40 news organizations teaming up, led by The Guardian, 180 journalists, all simultaneously writing about what's in these documents. And what's in these documents is a tale of all kinds of wrongdoing at the corporate level of Uber. And it's wonderful. It's terrific work. It's great work. I encourage everyone to read it. And yet, as I was reading it, I was thinking, God, I wish they had done this story, when Uber was actually doing the behavior that we're reading about back in 2014, 2015, 2016. And there's something like, I just think I agree with you. I feel like at some level, we've got to, as journalists, we've got to figure out a way to raise our game.
Yeah. I think part of it is having that extra degree of insight, or that willingness to say something doesn't add up here, even if we can't quite call it fraud. And I think back to your comments about the financial crisis, and it's true. I think journalists actually did a really good job in the run-up to the financial crisis of saying this housing market cannot continue. This is a problem. What we didn't do was connect the dots all the way through and say, and these things called subprime mortgages are going to ripple through the financial system and take it down. And I'm not really sure there was a way to do that in advance. You almost have to have that sixth sense to say there's this and a little bit of using the rule that we all learned in kindergarten, right? Use your imagination. That really bad things actually can happen, and a willingness to then reach a little bit and say, okay, these are the things nobody is talking about. But in some ways, it requires us to transcend our sources. I think too, and I think that for me that's the difficult step.
Wait, can you talk more about that? What do you mean transcend our sources?
Well, because we are taught that you have to be able to cross every T and dot every I, and in the run-up to the financial crisis, you weren't going to find anybody who was saying these things called subprime mortgages are going to take down the banking system, right? That wasn't, you were going to have to say that yourself. You weren't, you were going to have to raise that possibility and that question yourself. You weren't going to be able to say, so-and-so says, it's not as if that piece of information was out there waiting to be reported and we just weren't brave enough to report on it. It didn't exist in the ether. I mean, in small corners maybe. But so that's, maybe we need to have a little more, we need to go have instead of being so focused on dotting I's and crossing T's, we need to have a little more connecting the dots. and knowing that really looking at the last couple of decades and knowing that really bad things can result and are possible. I don't know, what do you think of that?
Well, one thing that sort of comes out of that I was wondering is how do you, get really familiar with an industry and whoever's in it, and or an entire section of the business world without getting lulled into whatever the state of mind of this sector is. Do you have a process by which you keep yourself sort of mentally or spiritually separate from the people you have to deal with every day?
So I think it was a huge advantage of not, and still is in some ways, of not being a beat reporter, because I look back on the Enron story and I think if I had been a beat reporter and had been sucked into the Enron story, I never would have been able to step outside that and say this doesn't make sense. And so I think there are pros and cons of being an old school magazine journalist versus being a beat reporter, because if you are a beat reporter, I think it's really hard not to get sucked into the worldview of most of the people you're talking to every day, including the corporation's worldview, because you have to be talking to them all the time to do your job. And how do you not let that start affecting the way you see things? Whereas if you come in from the outside, you can often say, oh, but this doesn't make sense, and you don't have any loyalty to these people, because journalists, we are unfortunately human beings like everybody else, and you can start to develop loyalty and fondness for the people that you talk to all the time, and I think it makes it much harder to call it. That said, I think the downside of magazine journalists has always been that you don't really know. I mean, you are starting absolutely from scratch, and you could be missing the big picture. One of the scarier things I've ever been told was when Jeff Skilling, the former CEO of Enron, was yelling at me on the phone, and he said, "You are doing something really unethical because you're clueless and you don't know what you're writing about, and you haven't done the homework to be writing this piece. And if you actually understood our industry and our company, then you wouldn't be saying these things." And I was like, that's true. I mean, there's an element of truth to that, right? So what do you think? How do you get around that issue of knowing something so well that then you've gotten sort of sucked into that worldview?
I don't feel like I know anything that well.
And that's maybe the starting point, is the humility too.
I remember being on a call with it was a background call with the Treasury Department in the early hours of the financial crisis, and they were trying to explain some really technical thing to us. And I had just started at American Banker. I think my first day was August 1st, 2008 as a banking reporter. And I didn't understand half of the words that were being used. And the call dwindled, and there was this technical person who was answering last questions, and it turned out that the last two people on the call were me and a Bloomberg reporter. And there was some silence, and the Treasury person was like, "Well, is there anything else?" And I was like, "Yeah, can you just explain whatever the concept was of the entire call?" I was like, "Could you just explain the foundational concept of this, because I'm not sure I get it." And the Bloomberg reporter was like, "Me neither." And not to knock Bloomberg, but it was actually really, really helpful. The person took a deep breath, and he was like, "Okay, this is what I'm talking about." And I was like, oh my God, I almost went through that whole call trying to pretend I got this finance thing that I had no business getting. I was one of my first jobs, One
of the best things that ever happened to me, one of my first jobs, I covered the police department in Rochester, New York. And I remember being really proud of myself because I got really close with the police chief. The police chief was calling me up. We were having coffee in the morning. He was, leaking all kinds of good stuff to me. And I just thought, man, I am so good at this, right? So it turned out during that whole time, when that police chief was spinning me and leaking to me, he was actually stealing hundreds of thousands of dollars of federal drug buy money from the Rochester Police Department. It was one of the best things that ever happened to me. That sort of yeah, okay, be careful of people who are too chatty with you. There's something else going on.
I have a friend, a well-known journalist, who wrote a piece. Somebody was leaking to her about a murder investigation, and it turned out the guy was actually the murderer. So we all have those stories. But I think the message here that we're all trying to convey is one of humility, right?
Yeah.
That for everybody in this audience, whether you're a journalist or an investor or whatever your role is, but always starting with that, I mean, to use a cheesy phrase, but beginner's mindset, knowing that maybe you don't know. Maybe you are missing the big picture. And the more you think that you do know, the more likely you are to be suckered. And I think about that all the time with Enron, because the people who had been around the company for forever, the really smart analysts and portfolio managers who own the stock, they swallowed it whole. And they knew enough to ask questions. There was enough there, but they had gotten seduced by the Enron worldview such that they didn't step outside that. And they weren't bad people. They didn't want to see their careers go down in flames over getting Enron wrong. They simply couldn't step outside the worldview that their own belief in their own expertise. And so maybe the more you question your own expertise and the more you're willing to say, maybe I'm missing everything here.
But I agree with the humility part for sure, and the paranoia part, and the reporting against your hypothesis part. But I also think that journalists also, at the same time, really have to be willing to stand on their own 2 feet and say, this is what this adds up to, which is scary.
Yes.
It's sometimes it's much easier not to do that. And there's all kinds of ways that you can avoid doing that. And I think my plea to my students is, when you've gone through that process and you take advantage of the fact that you are an outsider, take advantage of the fact that you are stupid and you don't know anything, and you ask all those dumb questions that get you someplace important, the critical last thing of like standing there and saying, this is what it adds up to, I think is something I hope more journalists do.
What's the role of an editor in holding your feet to the fire in that when that happens? And do you feel that editors do their jobs, or are they looking to duck from the conclusions as well?
Well, obviously, if something's missing from my story or it's not checked, it's all the editor's fault, not mine. No, I think I just like the process through which, if you have an adversarial, not like truly adversarial, but if you have a combat with an editor, you can get to a place that you can't get to on your own. It's just there's this force that's trying to like push you back, and it's not the outside forces trying to spin you. It's someone who's just like, I'm sorry, this doesn't pass muster. Like, this is just not cool enough, and you didn't do enough work. And being told that over and over again is, I think, what, obviously we all are very motivated, on our own, but like, your imagination takes you so far, and then this other person's imagination comes in and starts creating problems for you. And those are the best problems, I think.
Should we see if anyone wants to ask questions? We have a couple minutes left.
Give journalists a chance to talk about themselves, and off we go.
I see a hand in the corner back there.
Hi, Mr. Andrew. I was going to ask Jim this question. What have you come across, what company that has been I'll call it your Richard Jewell, that fit every qualification? Remember when they arrested him for the Olympic bombing? Like, oh, he definitely did it. As soon as you saw it, he definitely did it. And then it turned out he didn't do it. Have you had one of those? You did the work, you go, oh, this is definitely there. And they said, oh my God, there's nothing there.
Us?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, I've definitely spent good months of my life determining that there's no story there. Yes, yeah, 100%.
I've written about a lot of things that I expected to be big scandals because I thought they were really interesting and evidence of terrible behavior that then nobody cared. And so one of the things I've tried to do is to just separate myself from caring about the reception a piece is going to get. I think we go wrong when we try to write big stories that are going to win awards or get attention, because then you're focused on outcome rather than on, is this an important story? I think by the standards of sort of, do people care broadly about what I've written, I'd say most of the time in my career, probably not. I mean, with the exception of Enron, a lot of the things that I've written about that I thought were far worse behavior, people have just shrugged their shoulders and moved on. And I really try not to care about that, because I think if you do, then you're going at things backwards. What do you think, Emily?
Oh, actually, I've definitely been down dead ends, and I am cynical about the effects that my work will have on anything. But I still try to do it.
Yeah.
Question over here.
So I'll make a comment and a question. The comment is just, I feel like you guys are esteemed and great, and you've hit some big home runs, but I feel like the journalistic world, that in as much as it looks at fraud, is only trying to hit home runs and never trying to do, say, a story a week about a fraud. And so that you don't have a bench of reporters who've learned how to report frauds, little ones, little problems with companies, so that they can take some big swings. And so you've got to find a reporter who's got enough juice at his newspaper to get 18 months to work on a story and not publish a damn thing, which just doesn't happen in the real world. The New York Times is not the real world for most journalists, I would say. But so let me ask a question, because there are so many people in this room who could probably tell each of you about a fraud. How would you suggest news sources come to you with a fraud story that you weren't looking for?
Oh, that's a great question. Do you want to tackle that first?
I'm always ears wide open for whatever, ears wide open, eyes wide open, something, for whatever stories people think are interesting and important. But I do think that you raise an interesting point, which is how do you get that published these days? And that's harder. It's way harder than it used to be. I think at least in my view, I think there used to be a lot more space for the sort of the important story that maybe wasn't going to make a huge splash, and I think that's a lot harder today. I don't know if you guys would agree. You sit in a different place. I've mainly been a freelance journalist for the last decade at Vanity Fair, and so it's hard. It's hard for a story then that doesn't rise to the level of being a big magazine story. It's harder for me to find an outlet for it than it once was.
You know, I was at Reuters for 8 years, and I did those smaller stories, and to the people that were in the world that the stories were about, they cared, and I found sources and an audience, and I think that I'm so glad Reuters exists, Bloomberg, AP, and other business publications. Actually, you can be a beat reporter and you can do these things and write your treasury market reports, which I did for years. So it's not that no one wants to listen to a small story. It's just if it's a national publication, we do need to make it resonate with a wide readership. Like, how does this affect a lot of people? What is the wider implication of the story? That is definitely a high bar. But I don't think that there aren't journalists out there who don't have to meet that really, really, really high bar. I think that you can find them. And also, my Twitter DMs are open, and my email address is in my Twitter bio, and it's emily.flitter@nytimes.com.
My Twitter DMs are open as well.
I think we're out of time, right?
Yes.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
That was fantastic. We're going to take just a very, very short break to try to keep things going on time, particularly with Oxford. So we will start right back up in 5 minutes. Okay, so take a quick break if you need to. If you need to stay out for longer than that here, we understand. If you're at home, you can take a break and do whatever you need to do, and we'll start at Oxford right at 4:30 Oxford time.